On Tuesday we talked about two main things, mostly pertaining to why we're actually doing this, right? As New Testament believers, as Christians, why are we still committed to the Old Testament? Particularly in light of Paul and other folks talking about we don't need the law, right? We're not under the law, we're under grace. Adherence to the law doesn't actually affect salvation, doesn't bring about salvation, right? So now we're going to dive in. Starting next week, we're actually going to get into texts. We're going to get into the actual content of the class, right? We're still doing background information and discussing what we're actually talking about. We did, on Tuesday, address this, right? What do we actually mean when we're talking about Torah? Because we can mean a lot of things and it gets more and more complicated the more we talk about it. For the purposes of this class, we're talking about the Pentateuch, right? We're talking about the first 5 books of the Bible. What are we talking about? What are the books? Good. In that order. Okay, everybody knows it starts with Genesis. So that's what we're talking about. But part of this is also, we need to recognize that when we're reading the Pentateuch, it is shaped by our understanding of Christianity, our reading of the New Testament, which talks about the Pentateuch. It's also shaped by what comes after Torah, what comes after the Pentateuch. It's shaped by our knowledge of what happens to Israel throughout the time between, right? Deuteronomy ends with they're right outside the promised land and they're about to go in. And there's a bunch of stuff that happens, right? So we'll get into that today. But all of that shapes the way that we read the text. And so we need to keep these sorts of things in mind, this sort of context in mind, when we actually get into the text, to help us keep track of what's important. What's the thing that we're actually supposed to be getting out of these texts, right? We'll get into next week talking about the kind of creation narrative. What's the point of the narrative, right? A lot of us kind of are used to looking at Genesis, particularly the first few chapters, as what does this tell us about evolution, right? What does this tell us about the mechanisms through which God created the universe? And that is specifically not the point, right? And if we lose track of what the text is supposed to be telling us, then we're lost. We're not on board with what the authors are trying to have us gain from the text. Good? We'll talk about that next week. So let's start with a basic question. Who wrote the Torah?
Moses.
Okay, Moses. Good. What does that mean? Here, let's do it this one. If I told you Moses wrote the Torah, what does that mean?
Means that Moses physically wrote the Torah, like that.
Okay, did he?
God wrote them.
So we know Moses physically wrote the 10 Commandments, right? Anybody know the fancy word for the 10 Commandments?
But didn't God also write the 10 Commandments after Moses?
God wrote them first and Moses broke them.
Yeah.
And then Moses wrote them
Moses
himself.
wrote them again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The fun word for the 10 Commandments, anybody? Comes from Greek. I will probably use it, so I'm going to write it. The Decalogue, the 10 words, right? So we know God wrote it first, and then Moses got angry and broke it. And then Moses wrote it himself. So when later it talks about how he creates the Ark of the Covenant and puts the 10 Commandments inside, this version of the 10 Commandments is what Moses wrote. Moses, I guess in our picture, it's like stone tablets that he chiseled, right? So he took chisel to stone and wrote them himself. We don't know of anything else that Moses physically wrote. The text doesn't tell us that he wrote anything else, right? So like in Leviticus, when he's giving the law, which we call the Mosaic law, the law from Moses, He's describing it orally to the people. He's saying, these are the rules. He didn't write it down and publish it and circulate it for Israel to read, right? He is giving the law that's given to him by God. He's repeating what he's heard. But nowhere in the text does it say that Moses wrote it down, right? Later, we hear stories in Kings and Chronicles of like, there's this bad king for a long time, there's another bad king for a long time, there's another king, he's a good guy, he's digging around in the temple and he finds a book, right? You're familiar with the story, this happens a couple times in Kings and Chronicles. But they find something in the temple or in the palace, whatever, that seems to be the book of Moses, the law of Moses. They find some text. It's not this, right? This is, nobody's allowed to get in and look at this. So it's something, some scroll, some bound manuscript that they attribute to Moses. We also don't know what that is, right? We like to think, oh, King Josiah was digging around and found the Pentateuch, the whole thing. And that's just not what it says. That's not what it claims that he found. And so we just don't know. The other thing with saying Moses wrote it, how does Deuteronomy end?
Moses dies.
Does
Moses dies.
Does it not say Moses recorded, or at least, wrote more for them to take into the...
When Joshua goes in to conquer Canaan, he doesn't bring scrolls with him, as far as we know. I don't think it tells us, right? And he brought the library on a cart with the scrolls of Moses. I don't think that's how it presents the story. But you also have the issue of the end of Deuteronomy is Moses dying, which he very clearly didn't write, right? If we're saying parts of Torah are written pen and paper by Moses, he didn't write that part. And then, when is Moses born in the grand scheme of Israel's history? Right? Where is Israel when Moses is born?
In Egypt.
In Egypt, in slavery. There's a whole book that happens before Moses is born. So Moses does not have firsthand knowledge of any of that. Right? Moses does not have firsthand knowledge, eyewitness knowledge of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Israel and selling Joseph into slavery, or Adam and Eve, or the Tower of Babel, or Noah. All of those stories, he does not have access to. He doesn't have firsthand eyewitness testimony himself. He was not there. Very clearly, specifically, he was not there. So how does he get a hold of those stories? Even if we're saying he's the one who writes these things down, where does he come up with Genesis? Anybody?
Well, I've heard people say that God told him or something.
Yeah. Somehow, it is told to him. Whether we think that he goes into a trance on Sinai and receives the Pentateuch, and then comes down capable of reciting the whole thing and writing it down word for word, or he receives testimony, oral story, traditions that are passed down, right? For 400 years, the Jews are in Egypt, in slavery, clinging to one thing. The only thing that they have that they're clinging to is the promise that they're God's people, right? We're descendants of Jacob, and God promised Jacob a land. We don't have it yet, but we know the story. And so this is what they teach to their children and their children's children. They pass on this story to cling to hope, right? So it's possible Moses is raised in that, right? That he knows the stories because it's his people's stories, right? So when we talk about writing the Torah, it is a very messy idea. It is not the same thing that we think of when we talk about writing, because we are all literate. We live in a completely literate society. Even if you meet somebody who's illiterate, right? We are all in a literate society. It's expected that everybody can read and write. So the example I always use is like the word banana. When I say the word banana, some of you picture the yellow fruit. Some of you picture the letters in your head, B-A-N-A-N-A, right? You picture the letters. that is a hallmark only of literate societies. Literate societies would have no concept of shapes, symbols on here that match a physical item in the world. There's a yellow fruit here, and there's, you chiseled something on a stone here, and this somehow represents that. Unless you draw a banana on here, this cannot represent that. It's not the same thing, right? So when we talk about writing, we have to include understanding of orality, of understanding that establishing an oral story can suffice to be the person who wrote the story, right? So I'm trying to remember if we've talked about this in classes before with orality. We run into this issue a lot more with the Old Testament than we do with the New. The New Testament, yes, there's oral tradition. Yes, we have issues of like the Gospel of John has testimony that's not necessarily by the person who wrote it, right? Luke describes himself that way. I've gathered other people's testimony and I wrote it down. I've received oral stories and I'm writing them down for you. But that's all happening pretty quick, relatively. The stuff that's happening in the Old Testament takes longer. So when we talk about the law given by Moses, it does not necessarily mean that Moses is the one who wrote all the scrolls and put them in a box and gave them to Joshua to take into Canaan, right? It means that in an oral culture, the elder can sit down and tell a story. And the way that the story is told becomes established to where when you all retell the story publicly as a community, as part of your religious celebrations, you cannot tell the story wrong, right? If I tell a story to you all, and then you all get together without me and tell the story, if one of you tells it wrong by accident or by, being mischievous, trying to change the story, the rest of you are obligated as members of society to correct the story publicly. So if Caleb is telling the story wrong, the rest of you are required by like a shame culture to fix the story in front of everyone else while he's telling it incorrectly, right? Because maybe he made a mistake and we're going to correct the mistake. Or maybe he's an evil person trying to change the story I told you and you all need to get rid of the evil person, right? Either way, it's not like, oh, I'm going to pull you aside and say, hey, you got the story a little bit wrong. Next time you need to do it better. No, that's not how. You publicly shame them into fixing the story for everyone. So the story can be established in a way that is that's preserved in a way that our oral stories are not really preserved. We don't value oral stories being established the way that we value written stories being established, right?
Yeah.
I can't, if I pick up Harry Potter and I just change a lot of the words myself and then I publish it as my own, that will not work. No one would accept that. I would get in trouble with the law as well as society, right? Because it's written, because it's established. In an oral culture, it's the same thing with an oral story. You run into significant societal problems if you change the story that's been established. Good? Well, this makes sense?
You can get a message, because you said that. You're looking at my way to do it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're not wrong. So, one of the things we need to struggle with is who is actually writing these things down? And at what point in the history of Israel are they being written down? So that's the next question is, when is this written? We know it's not written before Moses, right? Like, as a ballpark. It's written sometime after Moses and sometime before Jesus, right? But that's still 1,800 years. I guess less than that, 1,400 years. We need to figure out when in this point, in this timeline, was this actually written down? And by this, I mean written down. So we could talk about the story being established orally, and we attribute it to Moses, and I think we should. But when is it actually recorded in a written form for distribution? That is a different question. Anybody have thoughts on this before we get into it? Questions? comments, heresies?
Well, something that came to my mind is like, don't people, I feel like a lot of people would try to like discount the Bible because of like even talking about like orality. It's like, how do you even know it's reliable?
Yep.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
blah blah blah. So
The classic example is a game of telephone.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So like, how I don't even know how I would respond to a person like that.
So the classic example now is that orality is by definition unstable, and we use the game of telephone that we played as kids. If I whisper something to you and you whisper it, you whisper it, you whisper it, all the way around and it gets back to me, it's not the same thing that I told you in the beginning, right?
Mm-hmm.
That through many iterations, it would the thing that I told him would change over and over,
Mm-hmm.
right? But what I'm trying to say with orality being part of a social construct is that it's not me whispering to you the story and then you whispering it and whispering it. It's me publicly telling you a statement and then you publicly telling her, and then if somebody gets it wrong along the way, all of us correct it, right? So somebody give me an opinion about something random. Anybody have a strong opinion about anything?
So what's the difference between the orality fix and the fix of written copy?
Okay, so Taylor Swift is great. Okay, so Caleb, Taylor Swift is great. Now you say the same thing to her publicly. I'm going to make all of us say it. Nobody else came up with a statement. So we're all going to take turns.
Taylor Swift is, oh gosh, great.
There you go, see? And he said the same thing, right? So far, the story is stable.
I'm not sure he said the same thing. He
Taylor
did.
Swift is great.
There you go, see?
Okay.
See, but look at what just happened. You called him out on a discrepancy in the story, right? And it wasn't even that the words changed. It's that the emphasis, the tone was different. And you publicly called him out, and then what did he do? He fixed it just now, right? Didn't even know that was going to work. But that's exactly what I'm saying is that is fundamentally different than if I whisper to him, Taylor Swift is great, then he has the ability to whisper something different to her and say, I don't know who you like. If I guess somebody, it's gonna seem me. I don't know. I'm trying to think of anybody else. Any other
Tripoli is great.
See? So, but he would have the freedom, if we were whispering it to each other, to change that and pass it off as what I told him, because you wouldn't know the difference. And then you would have to choose whether or not to believe him as accurately representing me. But since we did it publicly, there's no option. Right? Does that make sense? That worked out a lot better than I thought. So because we're doing it as a society, and because sharing the story publicly is a rhythm of our religious life, particularly in Judaism, you get together and tell the story as part of your family, as part of your local gathering, and as part of your collective temple worship. You tell the story. And people are... There's every pressure in the world not to get the story wrong, right? We come into the same sort of thing with written stories being recorded, where the difference would be if I wrote a note and passed it to Caleb, and then Caleb had to copy the note and pass it along, right? We would have the same sort of issues. But again, we have, and this is more with the New Testament, the issue of I have a note, and I write it and give it to Caleb. Caleb copies it, and then he gives both copies to other people, right? And then you all make copies and pass them along and it spreads. Eventually the copies are going to get back to me, right? In this classroom, there's only enough of us where there's a couple iterations where one of them is going to get back to me. And if it's wrong, who am I going to talk to, right? It hasn't taken long for the copies to get back to me. And if it's wrong, I'm going to go talk to him and he's going to say, oh yeah, I changed it. And then we're all going to get together and kick him out. Or he's going to say, no, I did it right. Somebody that I gave it to changed it. And then we're going to go and talk to them. And it becomes a corrective measure. And then, years later, we get together all the copies, right? Say there's 20 sticky notes floating around now. And we look at them and 19 of them are the same and one of them is different. it becomes very easy to tell, oh, one of them is not right. Right? By the manner, the organic method by which the copies were made, one of them is incorrect. It's not that we're making a theological choice, we like this version better. It's that one of them very clearly was not a correct copy of the others. So we're going to dismiss that one as not authentic, not original, not historically accurate. Right? Kosher? With oral texts, you don't have you don't have Moses writing it and giving it to somebody and then making copies of it. That's just not part of what happens, the way that it does with Paul, when Paul is circulating a letter and people are taking copies of it. But with Moses, it is very public still, the way that it's being written and shared. Good? Now, we still have to deal with this. So let's look at Israel as a whole. So this will be fun, and I don't know how long this will take us. So it'll take as long as we want it to. Let's talk about everything that happens in the history of the world from Genesis 1 until Jesus. Go ahead.
Wait, I don't know if you answered the question or if you're about to answer the question of when the Torah was written.
We already answered.
Okay, perfect.
So we're gonna talk about everything that happens in the history of the world, and then we're gonna pick where we think the Torah comes in. Cool. So what happens first? Let's erase all this. Creation. Cool.
Well, and then you do have to ask the question of how many of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness actually wrote.
I would say 0.
Very few, yeah.
Maybe
Moses-
3. I don't know. I mean,
well,
Moses,
did.
because Moses had a unique upbringing,
Right,
right? Trained by the same people that trained Pharaoh.
right.
But like nobody else did.
Right.
Slaves are not known for their literacy in 1800 BC. Like, okay, so creation is the first thing over here. We're probably going to have to meander in order to leave enough room. But at the end, we'll put Jesus.
Yep.
Right? It seems biblical, right? We'll put Jesus here. Jesus is born in 4 BC. I think, give or take. Okay. And creation, depending on who you ask, was a long time ago. Okay, we'll get into dating next week. What happens after creation? Okay, and then what? We're just going to go through. After the fall, we have, what's the next big thing?
Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel. And then they start to build cities, right? They develop.
Tower of Babel. That's what it is.
Yeah, it's Babel before or after the flood?
Before.
Let me spell Babel. E-L? Yeah, that looks better. Tower of Babel, and then I already gave away the flood. Right? Before the flood, there's a bunch of people, right? There's like thousands of people. And then after the flood, there's 8 people. Right? So it's widowed down to 8 people. So if you think about it, the story of any of this has to be filtered through Noah. Noah's the only person who could have carried any sort of oral tradition through any of this, right? Just as a historical matter. Unless we're going to say Moses goes into a trance and God just tells him everything that happened, and there wasn't any story recorded before Moses hears it. I don't really like that. I don't find that very scholarly. You know what I mean? I mean, the way that I put it is, that's what happens to Muhammad. Muhammad goes into a trance and receives revelation. And that's why we don't believe it, is because there's no veracity, there's no way to verify a claim like that. God told me so. Well, that's just I can't have a conversation anymore. Right? We can't look at history, we can't verify it with anything. It's just, you pull the trump card of God told me so, and the discussion's over now. Right? So, we have the flood, we've got 8 people coming out of that, and then we have Lot goes over Sodom and Gomorrah. I guess Sodom and Gomorrah is a little later. You've got
Well, you have Abraham, the establishment of Abraham.
yeah. So we'll end with flood. We'll put Noah up here, just as the new guy on the scene. Is there anything between Noah and Abraham? We'll just put Abraham. So you've got Abraham. Abraham is the rest of Genesis. It's talking about Abraham and his family, right? I mean, it's the rest of the story. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, right? Jacob becomes Israel. Israel has what? How many kids? How many sons?
12.
4 wives and 12 sons. All of them become 12 tribes of Israel, right?
Yes.
Good. What happens?
Joseph,
Joseph, what happens to him?
sold to slavery.
By who?
His brothers.
Bad call. I mean, bad call, but also it worked out, right? Joseph is sold into slavery where?
Egypt.
Egypt.
I think we may be wrong, Babel may have happened after the flood.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Because it's like the dispersion of
I think
people.
we're wrong,
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Because it's the table of nations and whatever, right? So let's do this. Flood, and then Babel. Because it's after Babel that they actually spread out,
Right.
right? They have different languages, they spread out, and this is where you get like the Shem, Ham, and Japheth going to different places. And
That was like chapter 11.
Babel's kind of at the end of that 1 through 11
Right.
section,
Right.
that the flood happens before that.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
like Genesis 12 or something.
That sounds better.
Yeah, something right in that group, yeah.
Let's talk about dates. Where are we at this point? We are now, Joseph is in Egypt. I guess let's finish this. What happens when they get to Egypt?
Well, at first it's fine, and then they get slavery.
Right. So at first, Joseph is like second in command, but this is 400 years right here that have passed by. They are well taken care of here. By here, they're slaves. We'll just write slavery because we know what we're talking about. Does anybody know any dates historically for any of this?
Besides creation being 0. I will give you that.
I mean, creation's not 0.
Well, it's a start, it's gonna be 1.
Yeah. There are folks who will argue that the earth was created in the year 6732 BC and it was a Tuesday.
Oh.
Congratulations. Like, I don't know what to do with that. We don't know dates for any of this sort of stuff. We can speculate about Abraham. We think Abraham is around, 1900 BC? Yeah, let's see. Because I normally put slavery here at 1400. And so I think that would put
1400 is the end of the slavery, or 1400
is the end when Exodus picks up.
Okay.
Yeah. Which would mean here is 1800, and then you can do the math backward to get to Abraham. But I think we traditionally put this at like 2000 or 1900. Good? It's hard to go any further back than this. So this is where people come up with the date of like the creation of the world. They look at the genealogies from Abraham backward, and they look at, oh, this person lived this long and died, and this person lived this long and had kids and died, and whatever, and they do the math. The genealogies are not meant for that. We see this in genealogies in the Old Testament where they will say things like, when Abraham was, how old was he when he had Isaac? 90, 100, 100?
It's like 100 something. Yeah, 100.
So the way the genealogy here would describe it, they would say Abraham was 100 years old when he begat Jacob.
Right.
And all of us know, no, he didn't have Jacob. He had Isaac. But what they mean by that is he started the line which led to the next important person, Jacob. Even though there's a whole other person in here, and therefore more time. And the genealogies just work that way, where they skip characters who don't really matter. And like in the story of Genesis, Isaac doesn't matter that much. Like the stories we know about Isaac are having to do with his father or his son, right? Like Abraham sacrificing Isaac doesn't really have a lot to do with Isaac. But we would describe it as when Abraham was 100 years old, he begat Jacob, Israel. And by that, the genealogy means that's when the next thing started. Even though when Abraham is 100, Jacob is not born yet. Jacob is still a long ways off. So the timing to get back to creation is, I don't think it's accurate. And I think it's silly to say that that's the point of the text. Because if it was the point, it would have said, in the year 670-42 BC, God created the heavens and the earth. And that's not the point. Anyway, there's a tangent for you. They're in slavery around 1400. What happens next?
The plagues.
Okay, I mean, before the plagues, who pops up? Who's the dude?
Oh, well, Moses.
Moses.
All of Moses, the burning bush, all that.
Right, and we'll get into all this. Moses is born as a slave, rescued from murder,
Yeah.
given to Pharaoh's daughter, and then Pharaoh's daughter turns right around and gives him back to his mom and says, "Hey, I found this baby. I'm going to take care of it." And by that I mean, will you nurse it for me and bring him to me when he's old enough? Like, which is, yeah, keep your baby until he's old enough. It's very strange. Moses comes along. You get the plagues, eventually leading to
Do we know?
the Exodus.
Would Moses' mother have gone to the palace during the day, or would
I don't know.
Moses? Okay, we don't know that.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know much about midwifery or nursemaidship in 1400, so I have no idea. There had to have been something that protected Moses from being killed, right? There had to be something that Pharaoh's daughter did in order to save him from being executed. Because if she turns right around and gives him back to a Jewish woman who just gave birth, then the soldiers are just going to come around and kill him. So something had to have happened to protect him. No idea what. I don't know if they refused to get him circumcised. I don't know if they refused to do these other things. I don't know if she sent him with a signet of like, this is the house of Pharaoh, don't kill this kid. I have no idea. I guess he was already circumcised, right? Didn't she know?
Yeah.
Didn't she like see him in the basket and know
Yeah.
he was already a Jewish baby?
Because it says in the text that his mother kept him as long as she could keep him hidden, which would have been more than 8 days.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know what the arrangements were at that point. He is raised in the temple, in the
In Pharaoh's
palace,
house.
in
Yeah.
Pharaoh's house, trained to be a friend of the next Pharaoh, right? A brother.
Well, I mean, he's essentially a pet of Pharaoh's daughter.
Yeah.
You know, it's like she's got her puppy and her kid.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I have a question. They're in slavery. They're doing these building projects. What do you all picture that they're building in your heads?
Like pyramids?
Yeah. Don't you guys picture them building pyramids? That is so historically wrong.
That's
It is way off. I'm pretty sure it's like the Prince of Egypt cartoon. They're
Yeah.
building the pyramids, right? What year is this happening when Moses is born? We're in like 1400. When are the pyramids built?
Six.
Way before Abraham,
Yeah.
right? The pyramids are like 3200 BC. I think the last pyramid that was built was like 1800 BC. The pyramids are way back in Egypt's history. They are well done with building pyramids by the time the Jews are on the scene. And I feel like that's just part of our like collective consciousness. We all think that they're building pyramids, and I'm not sure where that comes from. But 1400, the pyramids are all done. They're not. The Egyptians aren't doing this anymore. They still have slaves. They're still working on stuff, but they're not building big, huge pyramids, right? The aliens did all that. So we have the Exodus. They leave Egypt, and then what happens? What do they spend the next 40 years doing?
Wandering. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, Sinai and wandering.
Yeah. Wandering for 40 years. And then Moses dies. And then who takes over?
Joshua.
Joshua. We talked about this in one of my classes earlier. What is Joshua's name? How else to say this? Who else do we know that has the same name as Joshua? maybe if I spelled it differently.
Like, are we talking about
Jesus.
Yeshua?
Jesus,
Ah.
right? It's the same name. It's just names are super fluid in other languages. In English, the name is always the same. Other languages, they're very fluid. Anyway, that will be something to look at when we get to talking about Joshua. The way that the stories of Jesus and the story of Joshua relate to each other, right? How they reflect each other. How in what way or if Joshua is an archetype for Jesus or Jesus is an archetype for Joshua, right? They have the same name. And the same name kind of implies similar personalities. Not always. Could be. We'll look into it. What happens after Joshua?
Promised Land?
They're in the Promised Land. Yeah, good. And what are they doing in the Promised Land for a while?
Conquering.
They're just killing folks,
Yeah.
right? Not the greatest thing, right? But like it's what God told them to do.
They're supposed to
So,
be killing folks, and then they're kind of sketching on that as well.
Yeah. and that's a continuing theme. Is hey, I told you to kill all these people and you didn't, and now you're in trouble for not killing all these people.
Well, I never understood from our textbook until I read the textbook that the idea of devoting was from Israel to God, not God mandated to Israel until Israel brought it forward.
Meaning like
When the
devoting stuff to God.
Well, when the group of Israelite hostages were taken and Israel said, we'll recapture our hostages and devote the
Right. You make a
captors.
promise to God.
So we go in and we kill all the captors, looking extremely similar like today.
Yeah.
And devote that to God, and then I was a little unsure from the textbook because it sounded like the idea of devoting was then put into the Canaanite narrative, but
Yeah.
did that come from Israel or God? Because our text questions that.
Yeah, we'll get into that when we get there. We're gonna cruise through. We're gonna cover the whole thing. Who takes over after Joshua? Who's in charge after this? What's the next book after Joshua?
Don't you start with the
Judges?
same?
Judges. So after Joshua, we start to get into Judges, which are kind of elected, kind of appointed leaders for various times and needs, kind of ruling over. We also have Ruth in this time, right around here. And then what's the next big thing that happens? Ruth should give you a hint. Because Ruth marries Boaz and they have a kid. Anybody know?
Yeah.
So, well, Samuel and David.
Well, we're getting there. Ruth has a kid named Obed.
Obed and Jesse.
Obed has a kid named
Jesse.
Jesse, and Jesse has a kid named
David.
David. Right. So we're getting here, right? What is the next big thing that happens in this time? At the end of the Judges, who comes on the scene next?
Saul.
Saul. Samuel, yes. So I'll put Saul, but starting in Joshua, we've talked before about how all of this is called the Pentateuch, from the creation all the way to entering the Promised Land, the Torah, the first 5 books. Did we talk about Tanakh? Tanakh, yes. So this is Torah. The next is Navim, right? The prophets.
Yeah.
These books, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, maybe not Ruth, Samuel and Kings, are called prophets, the former prophets, because the organization of the story is around the central prophets, right? The story of Saul is centered around Samuel, right? And then it goes into David. Nathan takes over. The prophets are the people who are kind of pushing the narrative along. And that tells you something about the story. It's not a political story. The kings are not the main thing that's going on, right? They're not the main priority. We think Saul takes over around 1050, I think, to show you how much has happened in 350 years, right? They are slaves in Egypt, and in 350 years, they have a king in a unified kingdom. 12 tribes in Israel, the borders are set, right? I guess David expands them a little. This is where you have the kingdom of Israel. This is where you get David. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think, in my head at least, Saul is 40 years, David is 40 years, Solomon is 40 years. Am I wrong on that? That they rule?
I know David is
Because-
split,
Yeah, I
because
think
David,
so.
David rules 7 years where he rules part, and then
Yeah.
30-something
Um,
years where he rules.
The tension between David and Saul is, yeah. And if you read the book, if you read the Bible, the story tells a certain way. If you read like a History of Ancient Israel textbook, it makes this a lot more political. And to me, it was much more helpful to understand the stories that are going on in the Bible, of understanding like what's going on politically. If you read like an ancient History of Ancient Israel text, it reads much more like a Game of Thrones political, different kingdoms and vassal states and all this sort of stuff. Under Saul, Israel is its own sovereign nation. Okay, they do not report to anybody, right? David comes along and expands the boundaries. Solomon messes it up. He establishes the temple, right? But what's Solomon's big problem?
The inherited sin from David, he can't stay away from the women.
Yes. So
David fails to follow the text of don't make political alliances with your wives.
yes. So Solomon marries everybody that he meets for a long time. And then I would say, yes, that's the main problem. He starts worshiping other gods according to his wives and concubines. And then what happens when he dies?
His son is corrupt.
Yes, I would say the bigger problem is that he doesn't get everybody on board with who the next ruler is,
Yeah.
right? And so after Solomon, the kingdom is split, right? Jeroboam and Rehoboam, is that right? Which, and this is going to show you, I'm not an Old Testament guy. Until recently, like the last few years, I always thought Jeroboam and Rehoboam were like brothers. And they're super not. One of them is a usurper trying to take over northern Israel. And I just always thought with names like that, and they both take over after Solomon,
Right?
they must have been brothers that just couldn't agree on who was in charge. And that's not the case at all. What does the kingdom split into?
The southern and northern.
Okay, and what are they called?
Judah.
What's the northern kingdom?
Oh, Israel.
Yep.
The southern is Judah.
So the northern kingdom is Israel, and the southern kingdom is Judea. Capital of Judah is still Jerusalem. Is that right? Capital of Israel is.
Well, the religion, didn't they divide the religious between Bethel and Dan? The religious capital? Didn't he put the images at both ends so that they wouldn't travel to Jerusalem
I
and
don't know.
become,
I was gonna say Samaria
oh, okay.
as the capital here. I could be wrong. I don't know. So we have northern and southern kingdoms. The rest of the text for a while is, hey, this king was over here for a while, and then he did these bad things and he died. And this king was over here for a while and he did these bad things and he died. And then this king, back and forth and back and forth. The story very clearly at this point shifts to the prophets, right? Because there's like 6 kings that go on, but Isaiah is the prophet the whole time, right? And he's talking to this king about his stuff and this king about this stuff and this king about this stuff, right? You continue to move through. And then, let's see, do we have a time period for this? This is like 930 for the end of Solomon's reign. And then, eventually, what happens to both of the kingdoms?
Exile.
They get wiped out, right? So, I always forget who the big bads are. Israel eventually is destroyed in 722 by the Assyrians. Okay? Judah is eventually destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians. Okay? Yes, exile, whoever said that. Israel never really comes back.
That's 722.
722, 586. Israel is dispersed to the point where they don't recover. They don't come back. You've heard people talk about like the lost tribes of Israel, right? That's this. The 10.5 tribes that were in the north never really recovered. These are the folks who actually come back eventually. The 2.5 tribes that lived in the southern kingdom in Judah, centered around Jerusalem. 586 is when that happens. They are only in exile for 30-something years. Go ahead.
What's the size of a tribe?
It varies a lot. You'd have to look at the numbers, and I mean that literally. Numbers gives us like the sizes. At the point of exile, I'm also not sure because they've been warring for years. During this whole period, after Solomon, we call this the unified kingdom. Saul, David, and Solomon. Unified, northern and southern, the whole thing together. It reaches its peak with David, the biggest expanse of territory reaching the broadest borders. It shrinks again under Solomon. After Solomon, Israel is never really free, except for like isolated incidents. They are always what we would call like vassal states. So the Egyptians will come along with a huge army and say, hey, how's it going? Do you want us to destroy you or do you want to pay us money? And then what does Israel say? Here's our money, right? And then Egypt protects them for a while. But then Egypt loses some of its power and withdraws some of its territory, and somebody else comes in. The Syrians come in. And then the Syrians come and say, hey, do you want us to destroy you or do you want to give us some money? And so the Israelites pay them, whoever is in charge. And because of its geographic location, because of where Israel is located, it is always on the border of these huge empires fighting with each other. So the Egyptians and the Assyrians and the Syrians and the Babylonians and the Akkadians and whoever, they're always fighting. And so the vassalship of the northern and southern kingdoms is always changing and they're always paying money to people. And then there are stories of like, this king rises up and he's a really good king and he does this thing and he tries to say, we're not going to be a vassal anymore because we're God's people. And so we're going to try to be our own independent kingdom. And that never goes well, right? Either they are, and they successfully throw off tyranny for like a day, and then the king dies and the next guy's terrible. Or they come in and get slaughtered. Somebody wipes them out, right? And it happens a lot. 586, they go into exile. There are stories of return from exile. Where are those in our Old Testament? What stories describe coming back from exile?
Ezra and Nehemiah.
I'll put this up here. Ezra and Nehemiah. This is actually relatively quick after 586. This is
So do you agree with
like
the text?
539.
The 70 years of exile equaling this?
Yeah, I thought it was
70 years of exile and the years that the promised land should have had Sabbath, that it didn't?
What's that?
In our textbook, he points out that 70 years of exile equals the 7th year being the Sabbath year for the land that Israel failed to do that. So the 70 years actually equals the number of years of Sabbath that should have happened.
I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, it sounds like
I mean, it's
speculation. Like the text doesn't tell us that's why, right? And so that sounds like somebody saying, "Oh, I think."
Okay.
Well, when I see this number, it's what makes me think of. You know, I don't know. They start to come back. A lot of this is when they're allowed to come back. A lot of Jews don't come back. A lot of Israelites decide to stay in Babylon. They just don't. They're tired of it. It's been hundreds of years of this, and they just don't. They don't care anymore. Some people come back. They try to rebuild stuff, and this is a continuing issue for a while of who's in charge, who is allowing the Israelites to be in Israel? Who's allowing them to do these things? And this happens for a while. We still have, though, 500 years between where we're at now and what happens with Jesus, right? This is what I wanted to read from this book that I was reading earlier. Let's see. There was something interesting I was going to read, which has to do with where we're going next. But I can't find the text now. The rebuilding of the temple starts after this. So around 515, they start rebuilding the temple. It takes forever. They create, so this is according to this book, in addition to rebuilding the city and the temple, they created a law book that would in time become the core of Torah. Another word is the Pentateuch. The priestly compilers of the Torah gathered together strands of documentary materials and ancient stories that had been transmitted in oral and written form for many years, and stitched them together in a continuous, though not entirely uniform, narrative. Even though the Torah includes narrative and other material unrelated to law in a strictly legal sense, the form of the Torah gives the appearance that it would be read as the words of God to regulate Judean society. It's possible Persian authorization, so the Persians are the ones allowing them to do this, implies that the Torah was seen as a law because the Persians would not have been interested in getting the Jews together to write a story, a religious narrative. We come along, the Greeks come along and translate it as nomos, law. But the end of the 5th or beginning of the 4th century BC is the earliest date which anything close to resembling the Torah actually appears. So, the end of this, or the beginning of the 4th century, 400s. Jumping ahead. In the same period, scribes who modern scholars call the Deuteronomists, anybody familiar with these terms? This is what we're going to get into. Edited Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings in light of Deuteronomy. The basic theme in all of those histories is the editor's interpretation that all the good in Israel's history since the conquest of the land, right, Joshua, was because of obedience to Torah. Conversely, negative events were divine punishment for disobedience of Torah. You see where we're going with this? The narrative of the Deuteronomistic history has the appearance of antiquity, but much of it was finished after the exile. Do you see what he's saying? Much of the Deuteronomistic history, so this is Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, was written after this in order to explain God's favor or dissatisfaction with Israel for obeying Torah. Right? Among the prophets, Hosea, Amos, and Isaiah were active in the 8th century. Move along. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, minor prophets, poetic and wisdom. Apparently there was a peaceful period in Judea, first under the Persians, which is where we are here, and then when it became Hellenized. They are in a relatively peaceful state until 170. So we're going to jump down a bit to 170. Before all of this comes undone. But does anybody know what starts in 170?
Is that the power?
Oh, no, not yet.
Not yet.
That's later. This is rebellions. The Jews are saying they're not on board with it. So this is when you get like the Maccabean revolts. This is a lot of stuff that's happening in this time period is what you find in the Apocrypha. So you get the Maccabean revolts, you get these other revolts. People claiming to be the Messiah, or people claiming to be revolutionaries that will throw off the shackles of imperial rule and return Israel to this. This is what they're always trying to get back to. David, extended borders, king under God, and nobody else is ruling over us, right? What this book is saying, and what the scholarly consensus is, which we might disagree with, is that Torah and much of what we find in the Old Testament is written here, in this time period, under this peaceful Persian rule.
Well, it makes sense partially, just because, I mean, when you're talking about after Solomon, And even before that, I mean, through the conquest of the promised land, your ability to wield a sword was way more important than your ability to write.
Yep.
You know, then they.
Because you just took over somebody else's land.
Right, then they
They're gonna
took,
be mad.
and you gotta establish it, but then they took them to Babylon, and all the best of the best were taught were educated.
And
In
they
a uniform
they
way.
no longer had to worry about
And, yeah.
somebody coming and destroying us
I mean,
at any moment.
while they're in Babylon, it's really pretty peaceful in
Mhm.
terms of, they don't have to defend them, I mean, they've already lost.
Right.
There's nothing to defend themselves from, but they have this education, and the education seems to, at least in the inference, lead to a better lifestyle in Babylon.
Right. Any questions on any of this? I know it's a lot, and we've talked for a while about it. I mean, this is the whole Old Testament, so we're done after today, right? We don't have to come back for the next 7 weeks. Good?
What was the date that you gave for the Torah being written in the book? It was like 400 something.
Yeah, so we'll get into this. I'm about to erase all of this, so that's what I'm asking if anybody has questions on any of this. Good? I'm gonna need a picture. Good. Yeah. So I'll leave this. Actually, let's just talk about it. What we're talking about now is a theory. It's in your textbook. It talks about it briefly in like a little side blurb. The textbook does not agree with, just so you're all clear of what we're talking about, the textbook does not agree with the understanding of Torah that I'm about to tell you. Does that make sense? So there's this hypothesis of how the Torah was actually constructed, put together. The book that I just read was describing part of it. But the argument is that editors and redactors and scribes collate, get together lots of different information to put it together, and produce stages of the Old Testament. So this is called the documentary hypothesis. That's probably the term that people might be familiar with. That's what the blurb is in your textbook. The documentary hypothesis, let's erase some of it at least, because we won't talk about this stuff over here. Says that there are 4 main stages of the creation of the Old Testament. And each of them has a letter. Anybody familiar with this? JEDP. Yeah? No? Maybe. These are the stages of development in order, I think. They are the Yahwist, the Elohist, this should be a D, Deuteronomist, and priestly. Okay? The section of the book that I just read to you all described these last two, the Deuteronomist and the priestly constructions, additions, renderings, right? This develops back 150 years ago when this sort of stuff was super popular, okay? Piecing, pulling apart texts to say, well, this verse uses this word and the next verse uses this word, so they must come from 2 different sources, and somebody later came along and put them together, right? So it starts with this, talking about the Yahwist and the Elohist, because even in the very beginning, God is given 2 different names, Yahweh and Elohim, right? And so these like 18th century or 19th century German scholars look at that and say, there's a group of people writing texts using the word Yahweh, and there's a different group of people writing texts using the word Elohim, right? They will give dates to these. They'll say that the Yahwist is operating in this time period, David and Solomon, height of the kingdom. The Elohist is 100 years later, around here in southern Judah. The Deuteronomist is 1, 2, 3, probably down here, 700s BC. And the priestly class is way later, 600s, 500s BC. Okay? And that they are compiling this information. We tend not to think this way when we look at texts, right? But this was super popular for 150 years of Old Testament studies. What this book was alluding to, and I don't know if the author agrees with it or not, is that these stories are floating around and eventually are established as written stories. But scholars have gotten into the point where, and I think people have moved away from this argument, they will say that that Israel never really had the land in the first place. So they will say everything prior to, some scholars will go so far as to say everything prior to this is fiction. Right? That these people were nomadic, they had these stories, they had these aspirations, they had these mythical figures in their past. That David wasn't really the king of a united kingdom. He was like a brilliant warrior who helped them survive in their nomadic travels. But that in this time period, when they are in Babylon, they establish a story that justifies them coming back to the land. To say, oh no, we're not coming here for the first time, we actually used to be here. Right? And so scholars will take this to say they're inventing the story in order to justify their claim on the land. Right? I think what this book was saying was a little different. They were saying the way that the Deuteronomist organizes the story, it's organized around Torah, right? Which is not necessarily the way that we think about it. But what he's arguing is the whole point of the stories after Deuteronomy are to say your relationship with God is based on your obedience to Torah. It's not about the land or the kingdom or any of this stuff. It's about Torah and your obedience to Torah. And the reason that they're saying that back here or up here is because here, under Persian rule, they're establishing Torah as the law of the land. And they're saying, look back at all these stories where bad stuff happened if you disregarded Torah. We're giving you Torah. We've established it. We've written it. We've codified it for the first time as a written text. You have to obey it or else all this will happen to you. Do you see the rhetorical appeal? And so that's what this author is arguing is that was the function of those texts, of producing those texts over these couple hundred years, was in order to reinforce the importance of obeying the laws, of obeying Torah. Torah being the important thing that you have to obey, that you have to live by, or else. Questions on this?
Does that have a mean, like kind of how there's the documentary hypothesis? Does that have like a...
I think this is all part of it. It's all part of it. The documentary hypothesis is the specific way where like they will pull apart different texts and say, oh, this was written in this time period by the Yahwists, this was written in this time period by the Deuteronomists. This is just different scholars have different understandings of the reasons why, or the understanding behind it.
But it being written past the Ezra and Nehemiah time, is that one of those, or was that something different? Does that fall under one of those?
No, it doesn't. So
Okay.
these are ancient peoples.
Yes.
that are getting together and writing. This idea of when it was written is like modern scholars saying this,
Okay.
right? Coming up with a story of when it was written and for what purpose. To justify a claim on the land or to reinforce following the law under Persian rule so the Persians don't come and get us, right? Why do we say all this? It is impossible to know for us, for certain, who wrote Torah, right? For us to know which person sat down and wrote it and in which context. I've given you 2 or 3 different kind of ideas, theories of when these things happened. It's impossible for us to know. So it's impossible for us to know these sort of background, behind the scenes ideas of who's writing it and why. Were they really writing it to reinforce ideas of Torah to obey in order not to get the Persians to come down on us? Were they really writing it in this time period in order to prevent what inevitably was going to happen? Right? There's different theories floating around about all of this. I go through all this to say, when we approach the text, starting on Tuesday, all we can do is work on the text that we have in front of us. Right? That is what has been passed down to us. So next week we're starting Genesis 1 to 11, the creation narrative, and I guess we erased it, the stuff we erased, right? We do not have the luxury of speculating about who wrote it and why, about any of this sort of stuff that's happening. All we can do is deal with the text as it's in front of us and try to glean what we're supposed to get out of the text from it from the text itself. Does that make sense? I would say, given all of this, some of us, it makes it hard for us to believe in like the inspiration of Scripture sometimes. That's how I feel a lot of the time, going through this sort of messy history of like, okay, but how do we trust any of it? How do we know that any of it is true or accurate if it's got this messy background? Does anybody have a beacon of hope for us?
I feel like the messy background means that it's that much more of God, because human organization couldn't accomplish it.
Okay. But
The fact that it works, they didn't know what worked.
But we take the stance that all Scripture is God breathed, right? That it's inspired by God and intended to be there. So with this sort of messy background, how do we say, oh, I still think Genesis is inspired, despite all of this? Does anybody have a thought? The answer that I was going to point to was on the board and I already erased it, so I'm going to have to rewrite it. Anybody have a thought?
Jesus.
So, yeah.
They didn't know what they were, at points in the narrative, they had an idea what they were pointing toward, but they didn't know. They had no idea.
Right? So not just that it points to Jesus, specifically, what does Jesus do when he's on the scene?
Well, he works forward and backward in all of it. He refers to Torah,
Right.
He brings it into, if you believe in Jesus, you can't really take his words and believe and not believe in Torah and Old Testament.
At no point in Jesus' ministry does he get into an argument with anyone about what books are in or out.
Mm-hmm.
At no point does somebody say, hey, you're quoting from this book, but I don't think that's reliable. Right? That is never an argument that they have. They argue about stuff. That's never a point of contention. Jesus and all of his disciples and all of their opponents are all on board with which texts are included. Right? We get into like Paul quotes, Roman philosophers and stuff like that, which are obviously not included. But at no point does Paul argue with people about these texts are sacred and these texts are not. It's not until you get to like people starting to include Paul and Peter as sacred texts, their own writings, that you get into any sort of discrepancy. Right? Obviously the Pharisees would disagree that Paul's writings are on par with Torah. But at no point does Jesus say, oh, you guys shouldn't be reading that, right? I didn't plan for you guys to have this one, right? At no point is that ever an argument. So when Jesus comes on the scene, this is what I erased, but I still wanted to have it. He is fully on board with having these discussions based on the Tanakh, based on the law and the prophets and the writings. He never comes and says, hey, you guys are reading from Song of Solomon. You guys shouldn't be doing that. Right? This is what Martin Luther comes along and says, I don't like that book, and we're going to ignore that one. Right? At no point is that an issue for him. So for me, that helps reinforce, if any of these books were suspect, that would have been addressed at that point. Was that helpful for anybody? That helps me. Go ahead.
By the time Jesus was around, did they have the entirety of the Old Testament, or did they only have the Torah?
Everything is written by this time. Most of it, I think, is already translated into Greek. So the Torah for sure is already written. The earliest iteration of the Septuagint is just the Torah, but it happens hundreds of years before Jesus. The New Testament authors quote largely from the Septuagint, and it's relatively stable at that point. There's arguments historically about whether or not the intertestamental books, the books that are written after here, the stuff that's in the Apocrypha, if those were considered canon in Jesus' time, the official position on them wasn't really taken until 200 AD. And so some people will say, oh, in Jesus' time, Maccabees was on par with everything else, and then later they decided it shouldn't be. And some people will say the opposite. No, Maccabees wasn't really on board, even in Jesus' time, and people later tried to get it in. So there's some sort of debate about that. What we think of as the Old Testament was fairly well established at that point. There's minor arguments in the scholarly world now about books like Esther, right? Was Esther considered canonical in Jesus' time? And historically, it's kind of hard to tell. There's no real way to know.
And the end of Esther, that one section that's considered apocryphal sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of books have that. So Ezra and Nehemiah, if you pick up like a Catholic Bible, they're called Esdras. So this is one Esdras. This is two Esdras. And then there's also a 3 and a 4. 3 and 4 are out, right? They're considered secondary, apocryphal, not apocryphal, the Apocrypha. And these are in for the Hebrew Bible and our Old Testament, right? But there's a lot of stuff like that that's just, there's additions to books, there's extra stuff that we don't.
Well,
We
and
don't
like,
mess with.
isn't Ecclesiasticus considered to have been written fairly soon before Jesus?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure of the dating.
200 years before Jesus or something.
Oh yeah, 200 years. Yeah, I mean,
Coming up
I mean
to
Maccabees
his
is
time.
recent
Yeah,
comparatively.
it's very recent,
Yeah.
yeah.
All of this to say, when we approach the text, we have to have a different methodology than I'm trying to get behind to see what's going on here politically in 5th century BC Persia, and that's the only way that I can understand the meaning of Genesis 5, right? We just can't operate that way. Most scholars now don't. Even if people still subscribe to this, they still see a very limited amount of results, of benefit that you can get out of it. When actually approaching the text and trying to get meaning out of it. Does that make sense? So when we're reading Torah, we're going to say Moses wrote this for some reason or another, right? When we're reading, why did Moses write this? But now that we've had this discussion, I think we all kind of recognize it's a lot messier than just thinking Moses took pen to paper and wrote these things down. We can use these terms colloquially now that we all kind of know what we really mean by it. But the main point is that when we're reading the text is the most stable thing that we can use for our interpretation of it. Okay? So when we're reading it, we need to use the text that's in front of us as the interpretive tool. Okay? Trying to pull from history or science or whatever else is not going to be as helpful as looking at the text as it's come down to us to say, what does the text want us to get out of it? When we're reading the text, what does it intend for us to understand? Does that make sense? That's my shtick. Next week we will actually get into it. We will do Genesis 1 through 11. Read your textbooks, read Genesis. I would say keep going so that you don't fall behind when we get to the longer stuff. But if everybody can read 1 through 11 before Tuesday, that would be helpful for our conversation on Tuesday. Good? Any other questions or comments?